You came for the blonde girl on the thumbnail for sure. I can see why. This is my niece. She's 13 years old and she wants to start photography. So today we talk about the super basics of photography, the very minimum that you need to know in order to get started, experiment and have fun making photos with your camera. First, I think it's good to remember that photography comes from two Greek words, phos, which means the light, and graphe, which means drawing. So literally, photography means drawing with the light. There are different ways of drawing / capturing the light. Our ancestors were doing it chemically, and to be fair, some people are still doing it chemically. However, with our modern cameras, we are doing it now electronically. The light enters through the lens and hits the sensor. The sensor converts the light into electrical signals. The electrical signals are converted by the camera into data that are stored on a memory card. If you think you know already how your camera works, you can jump directly to the next chapter about the exposure triangle. You will find that chapter in the video description below. Alright, now you have your brand new camera in front of you. You insert the battery, you charge it. Usually there is a little LED light that indicates that the camera is charging. Here you see on my R7 it's green, on my Sony it's orange, and on my X-T5 I think it was red. When that LED light is turned off, then your battery is fully charged. Before turning on your camera, you want to attach a lens to it, which will be probably the kit lens sold with your camera. Try to be quick and keep the camera face down to avoid getting dust on the sensor. On this Canon, you have to push that button. You align the red dot of the lens with the red dot of the camera and twist until you hear a click. You remove the lens cap. You check if the glass is clean. You also want to insert a SD card in there. I am using Lexar and SanDisk. If you need a fast one, look for a V90. A cheaper but slower card would be a V60. And you have also super cheap and super slow with the V30. But if you don't want to buy twice, buy directly the best, a V90 SD card with 64 GB or more. Only now is the time to turn on your camera. I am demonstrating here on the R7 because that's the camera my niece will get, but most cameras usually have the same kind of switches and button, unless it's a retro style camera or a very entry-level camera. So here when you switch on your camera, you are in photo mode. One more switch to the left and you would be in video mode. We don't go there. Now the camera is turned on and we are in photo mode. Let's have a look at another very important dial, the mode dial. Basically that dial is used to choose how much you control your camera. You can control everything with the manual mode, or only the shutter speed, or only the aperture. Two things that I will explain later. Or you can also let the camera make all the decisions for you with the automatic mode. We will simply switch that mode dial to M for manual. We have now full control of our camera. Easy so far, right? We attach the lens, we put a fully charged battery in, we put a SD card in, we turn the camera on in photo mode, and we go with the manual mode. Now remember what photography is. Drawing with the light. There are two ways to manage the light entering the camera, and one way to amplify that light if needed. This is called the exposure triangle. Very important stuff. This is the basics of photography right here. The exposure triangle. Only three things that you have to control: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. And those three things works together. The first way, the aperture. You can control the amount of light going through the lens with what we call the aperture. It is simply the fact of opening and closing a number of blades inside the lens. The aperture can be controlled by a ring around the lens or a wheel on the camera. Simple as that. The more you retract the blades, the more light goes in. It is represented by f-stops. At f1 the blades are super retracted, there is a big hole in the lens and a lot of light can go through the lens. At f16 it's a very dark aperture, the blades are very closed and there is a small tiny hole inside the lens, so the image will be very dark. Second way of managing the light, the shutter speed. You can control the shutter speed of your camera, also usually with a wheel placed on your camera. The shutter is a curtain or some kind of blades that are right in front of the sensor. When you take a photo, the shutter will open, usually for a fraction of a second, but can be also a full second or more. And the longer the shutter stays open, the more light will hit the sensor. Landscape photographers sometimes mount their camera on a tripod and use a very slow shutter speed in order to gather more light. Astrophotographers, I think, use a shutter speed of around 15 seconds to get enough light from the stars. The longer the shutter is open, the more light hits the sensor. Also a simple concept, right? Now you know the two ways to control the actual light reflected on your scene that will be captured by the sensor, the aperture and the shutter speed. There is also a way to amplify that light if needed. It's called ISO or ISO. The ISO number, also controlled with a wheel on your camera, will boost the sensor sensitivity to light, making your image brighter. Now the only problem with the ISO is that the higher the ISO number is, the more noise or grain you will get in your image. So you always want to keep your ISO as low as possible and try to get enough light using the shutter speed and the aperture in the first place. Here is an extreme example at ISO 32,000. If you zoom in, you can see the noise. If you look on the LCD screen of your camera, those three values of the exposure triangle are usually found at the bottom here: shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. On the R7, this is the wheel that controls the aperture of your lens. This is the wheel that controls the shutter speed. And for the ISO, you have to push that button, and this wheel is now controlling the ISO. It was easy, right? But that's not it. There is just two more little things, but very important things that you have to know. And after that, I will show you a few practical examples. We saw that the aperture controls the amount of light going through the lens, but it also controls the depth of field of what is in focus in your image. The higher the f number, the bigger the depth of field is, so the more things will be in focus in your image. Here is what you see with a wide open aperture of f2. We have that much in focus, and this is with a small aperture of f11. And now you see that we have a lot more in focus. In landscape photography, you usually want everything in focus, therefore you will use an aperture of f8, f10 until f16 or more, which is a very small aperture. For portrait photography, you usually want only the subject to be in focus in order to get some kind of separation with an out-of-focus blurry background. For example, I am right now using an aperture of f2.8, which is kind of wide, so you can see maybe that the background is a little bit blurry. Now the problem we create by choosing a specific aperture is that we add or remove some light to our exposure. So we have to compensate with either the shutter speed or the ISO, or both. Look, here I am closing slowly my aperture because I want more things in focus in my image, and everything goes dark. So what can I do? I can go with a slower shutter speed. My shutter will be open for a longer period of time, therefore my image is getting brighter again, you see? Or I can boost my ISO, as you see here. Here is a practical example using the aperture. So here, if I do a portrait of that potato, we decide that we want the subject in focus and the background blurry. So what can we do? We fully open the aperture of my new Viltrox 25mm f1.7 at f1.7, and we are gathering a lot of light. Too much light actually. So what can we do? We can lower the ISO, which is good because we learned already that at higher ISO we get more noise in the image, and that's bad. But what if we are already at the lowest ISO of 100? We can choose a higher shutter speed, of course. The light will hit the sensor for a shorter period of time. Therefore, we are making the image a bit darker. You see that we have a nice separation of the subject related to the background. Now let's say you want the potato and the tomato in the background in focus. Then you choose a small aperture. So we have to scroll to get a higher f number or f-stop. And now you have both in focus. But again, you have to compensate for the loss of light. So what can we do? As you can see, we can go for a slower shutter speed, or we can go for a higher ISO, or a combination of both. To summarize the aperture, f2 is a wide aperture / hole inside the lens that will let in a lot of light and give you a shallow depth of field, perfect for portrait, for example. f16 is a tiny hole inside the lens, it's a very small aperture, and not much light will go through the lens, but you will have a lot of things in focus. You will have a bigger depth of field. Good for landscape, for example. Now the last part of the exposure triangle. With the shutter speed, we control the duration of light exposure to the sensor, but the shutter speed also affects the motion in your image. A fast shutter speed will freeze the motion, and that's useful for sport and wildlife photography, or if you are shooting handheld at some degree. A slow shutter speed will not freeze the motion and could give you some artistic effects. Things will be blurred voluntarily, if you will. It's often used in a waterfall, for example, to give some motion effects to the water, or to photograph cars moving in the night. Here is a photo of my niece moving two LED lights with a shutter speed of 1 second. So the shutter is open for a full second here, letting in a lot of light, but as you see, the action is not frozen at all, and we can see the whole movement of the light. And I can tell you that it's hard to keep the head still while moving those two LED lights. It took a long time to get a decent result. Here is a photo of my niece jumping with a fast shutter speed of 1/1600th of a second. The shutter speed is open for an extremely short period of time. The motion is frozen, but of course I had to compensate for the lack of light. With a very fast shutter speed, the image becomes very dark, so I had to open my aperture and correct my ISO with a higher number. To summarize the shutter speed, with a slow shutter speed, the sensor will gather a good amount of light, but if your subject is moving, the subject will be blurred, and if the hand that you use to carry the camera is shaking, then the whole photo will be blurred. With a fast shutter speed, you will freeze everything, but the sensor will not gather that much light. Therefore, you will have to compensate by opening your aperture to a smaller f number / f-stop, or you go with a higher ISO, or a mix of both. Now, if you are still a little bit confused, do not worry too much. It's really when you are outside playing with those three wheels, aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, that you will start to get some muscle memory. It really helps to see the things changing in real time at the back of your camera on your LCD screen or in your EVF. And of course, the more you practice, the more it will become easy. Now, a few more things on how to take the picture. Once you get the image you want on your screen using all what you just learned, you push this button, the shutter button. By default, when you half press it, the camera will focus in whatever focusing mode you are in. I think by default it's a single autofocus with spot autofocus. If not, let me show you with that exact setting of single autofocus and spot autofocus so that you have at least one focusing tool in your bag. You click on Quick Menu here. To navigate in the Quick Menu, you go up or down with the D-pad of your camera. Once you are on the autofocus area icon, you go left or right with the D-pad of your camera and you choose Spot AF. Now you click just once down with the D-pad of your camera and you are now in the autofocus operation. You click single autofocus and that's it. The other one is the servo autofocus for subjects that are moving, just for your information. And if you want to go to servo autofocus, you may want to choose a bigger autofocus area, like zone area for example. So here is the example with the single autofocus. I half press, the camera focus in whatever is in the center of the frame, and if I fully press, the camera take the photo. Not that you can move that spot where the camera is focusing with that joystick, so you can focus everywhere on the screen. You have actually a lot of different autofocus modes and a lot of autofocus areas to choose for a lot of different situations, but I will not dig further in this video. A word about composition. There are rules that you can play with and break once you know them. The rule of third, the leading lines, the natural framing, and more. Overall, most of the time you want to achieve a visual balance with your image. You don't want your composition to be too heavy on one side or the other. I will advise you to look at some YouTube videos from time to time from different persons doing different genre of photography to reinforce and sharpen your knowledge. But the best is really to go out and try things. And if there still is some problems that you can't overcome, you just Google it. One last thing, if you shoot in JPEG, which is probably the format by default, you want to have a look at the white balance options in the near future. It's right there in the quick menu. I think that now you have enough information so that you can turn on your camera and start to experiment and try things. The exposure triangle is really a big one. Once you master it, I guess you are not anymore a snap shooter, you are a photographer. Feel free to comment below if I forgot something important. And now I think it's time for you to go in your garden and practice before you forget everything. Bye!